Buenos días, amigos míos. Me llamo Declan Kennedy. Estoy aquí en la Universidad de Cork, en el sur de Irlanda. Cork es la segunda ciudad en Irlanda, en el sur de Irlanda. Y el profesor más famoso aquí es George Boole, Boolean Algebra, muy famoso. Estudié el español cuando era en la escuela, pero tengo pocas palabras, lo olvido todo. Y no puedo enseñar en español. So I'm sorry I cannot give this lecture to you in your own native language, the wonderful tongue of Spanish, but I hope that the translation will get across the message to you. I'm delighted to have been asked to speak at your conference, and I want to do a number of things in the next 30 minutes. Firstly, I want to have a look at some of the background work that we in University College Cork, UCC, have carried out. I want to talk about the progress that we've made and give an indication of how we achieved that progress. I also want to talk about the staff training that needs to be carried out and delivered to staff in order to help them implement a learning outcomes framework successfully. And then I want to finish up my short presentation on some ideas about looking to the future. Now, the story in UCC began in 2003 when UCC participated in a European-wide Universities Association project. And it was looking at implementing a learning outcomes approach to teaching. As you can see there, implementing a learning outcomes approach to teaching. In other words, how do we bring in a framework involving learning outcomes and applying this framework to teaching and learning? Now, nothing would have happened in this university were it not for Professor Anya Hyland, who at that stage was Professor of Education in the university, and also Dr. Norma Ryan, who was involved in heading up the Quality Promotion Unit. This was a very successful project, and it led to a number of international symposia being held in University College Cork. This is one of them, implementing learning outcomes and implications for redefining teaching and learning. This is how I became involved, because I was asked if I would make a presentation on learning outcomes, because as part of my PhD, I looked at this whole area of learning outcomes. I'm a lecturer in the education department. My main job is training science teachers. My background is in science. My first degree was in chemistry and physics. And then I specialized in education. I did a higher diploma in education and a master's degree in education in the University of York, and followed that up with a PhD in education. So all my life I've been involved in education. These are the two ladies who really got the ball rolling, Anya Hyland and Norma Ryan. There was also involved, and is still involved, our Vice President for Teaching and Learning, Professor John O'Halloran. This was one of the papers that we wrote because in many of the countries, I've given training in over 30 countries around the world, and in many countries around the world, people ask me about the relationship between learning outcomes and competences. And I'll be talking about that later on. Now, to carry on, everything was driven by the Bologna process. There was a deadline that by 2010, all modules and programs in third level institutions throughout the European Union had to be written in terms of learning outcomes. So I was asked to do the training part of these learning outcomes sessions that we ran for the professors in our university. And when I started doing the training first, I would bring in papers from the literature. But my colleague said, "Oh, Declan, we do not have time to study these papers. Could you write something much more simpler?" And so that's exactly what I did. So I wrote this book, as you can see, Writing and Using Learning Outcomes, a Practical Guide. It has been hugely successful. It has been translated into something like 13 languages to date. The latest of one, recently I was out in Saudi Arabia for the launching of the Arabic translation. And it has been so successful because of the fact that so many countries are moving towards a learning outcomes framework. Now, I realize that your own native language is Spanish, and I did 3 training courses in Chile, and they translated the book into redactar y utilizar resultados de aprendizaje. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. My Spanish is a bit rusty. But so the book is already available in Spanish, and everything you need to know about learning outcomes is in that book. In the book, we introduce the idea of learning outcomes. We explain what they're all about. We explain how to write learning outcomes. We then go on to link learning outcomes to teaching and learning activities and to assessment. And this is a special chapter. This is only in the Spanish version, because here in Ireland, we do not use competences in our teaching. So we don't have any need for this chapter in Ireland or many other countries. So I wrote that chapter specifically for the Spanish translation. And then the final chapter, looking to the future. There's an appendix there with a glossary of all the various terms. And the second appendix gives many examples of learning outcomes that you would find useful in your own subject area. So we started off by giving the training to our professors here in University College Cork, explaining what learning outcomes are all about, explaining why they're important, and explaining the differences between learning outcomes and aims and objectives. Now, when learning outcomes were introduced into our university in 2006, all of our courses were described in terms of what we call aims and objectives. So the first thing in our training that we had to do was to clarify the difference between aims and objectives. That is key, the training. The professors need to understand the distinction between the teacher-centered approach to teaching and learning and the student-centered approach. In the teacher-centered approach, which is the traditional method, all of the focus is on the teacher. The teacher decides what to teach, the teacher writes the aims and objectives of the course, and uses words like know, understand, be familiar with to describe the aims and objectives from his or her point of view. On the other hand, learning outcomes focus on what we want the students to be able to do. So learning outcomes are often referred to as zooming in on the student-centered approach to teaching and learning. Now, the Bologna process is, of course, the driving force behind all of this. And what the Bologna process is essentially all about is it's an agreement between 46 countries in order to improve the effectiveness of higher education in Europe. I'll come back to that in one moment. In the past, qualifications and qualification structures were described very often in a very vague manner. It wasn't very clear to somebody looking at the description what the professor was actually teaching and what the students were actually achieving. So all of these countries, all of the European Union, all 27, and also the non-European Union, have signed up to the Bologna process. It is amazing that so many countries are agreed that learning outcomes is the way forward. The Bologna process, it isn't just a European Union initiative, as you saw from the list of countries. The agreement is in fact between EU and non-EU countries. And essentially, if you had to describe the Bologna process in one sentence, that is the sentence. It is the setting up of a system to make it easier to understand the description of qualifications and qualification structures. That is a summary of what the Bologna process is all about. Now, it's not the only aspect of the Bologna process. It is the most important one, making it clear what we are teaching and how our degrees compare with each other. There are other important areas of the Bologna process, like the mobility of students, like a system of credits, like quality assurance. I mentioned earlier on that Norma Ryan was very much behind the introduction of learning outcomes because she could see it as a key aspect of quality assurance here in this university. So what about learning outcomes in the Bologna process? Well, the ministers for education of all of the Bologna countries that I listed out there earlier on, they meet from time to time. And every time that they hold a meeting, they issue what's called a communique, a message. So in Berlin, notice they stress the importance of learning outcomes in the Bologna process. Again, they stress it in Bergen. In London in 2007, again, they stress the key role that learning outcomes are playing in the Bologna process. So, in the Bucharest communique that they issued, they made a very strong statement. They said that the Bologna reforms have changed the face of higher education across Europe. And that's all due to the staff involvement in making sure that Bologna is not just something theoretical, but it's actually reflected in our teaching and learning. Now, I mentioned earlier on the importance of learning outcomes being at the heart of the Bologna process. But of course, learning outcomes are also linked to ECTS credits. Learning outcomes can be compared to the common language of education in the Bologna process. And ECTS credits are like the common currency. So ECTS credits are what the students get for having achieved the learning outcomes. I'm sure you're probably familiar with ECTS credits, but so I won't go into any great detail, other than to say that throughout all of these countries that have signed up to the Bologna process, the workload for a year is 60 ECTS credits. And one ECTS credit is worth between 25 and 30 hours of work for the average student. So, generally speaking, learning outcomes and ECTS credits go hand in hand. Remember that the students get ECTS credits when they've achieved the learning outcomes. Now, the Bologna process, as you're probably aware, puts forward the idea of 3 cycles. In other words, bachelor's, master's, and PhD. It also puts forward the idea of generic descriptors, broad, general statements, not learning outcomes, but generic descriptors for each cycle, and ECTS credits range then for bachelor's and master's. So, generally speaking, these general descriptors in the Bologna process are broad, general statements. Now, the reason I'm mentioning these generic descriptors, commonly referred to as the Dublin descriptors, is because some people mix them up with learning outcomes. They are not learning outcomes. These are broad, general statements. Learning outcomes are specific statements describing what a student can do, having completed a course, like a short course, like a module, or a longer course, like an entire program or a degree. So, in the first cycle, bachelor cycle, these are generic descriptors. These general sentences, like have demonstrated knowledge and understanding in a field of study that builds upon their general secondary education. That's a broad general statement which describes every course in every subject in every university. And likewise, there's a second cycle for the masters, and likewise there's a third cycle for doctoral. So I'm just mentioning those in passing. Now, the one question that every professor asks when they're told that our university must be compliant with the Bologna process is, how do I write learning outcomes? And we are very lucky that a man called Benjamin Bloom left us the toolkit for writing learning outcomes. Bloom was a very interesting character. He did his Bachelor in Education in Penn State University and also did his Master's there. And then he went on to the University of Chicago to do his PhD under a very famous educationalist called Ralph Tyler. And when he was teaching in his university and lecturing to these students, he always had one thing at the back of his mind. Am I getting these students to think? Or are they just sitting there, not really taking in what I'm saying at all, just absorbing it like water into a sponge, but not thinking about it? And he wrote what is probably the most important book ever written in education. He wrote in 1956 a book on Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives. And he described how we learn. We take in the knowledge first, then we try to understand the knowledge, then we try to apply the knowledge. Then our brain will go into the higher order thinking skills, 4, 5, and 6, of analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. And Bloom said that these areas of our thinking are characterized by certain verbs. I will go in due course during our training to how we write learning outcomes, but we write them using Bloom's taxonomy. I want to mention in passing the distinction between competences, objectives, and learning outcomes. Generally speaking, the word competence is a broad, general statement. It can be quite vague. It uses words like know, understand, be familiar with. Objectives give us more detail, but not enough. It is only when we write learning outcomes that it becomes very clear what exactly we mean by a competence. Now, when I was in Chile, a lot of the courses there were written in competences, and the professors were quite worried. But it is not a problem. All you have to do is translate the competence into the simple language of learning outcomes. Note some characteristics of learning outcomes. Number one, they all start with an active verb: describe, draw, solve, design, and so on. And note also they are simple sentences, nothing complicated. So generally speaking, that's why learning outcomes rather than competences have become the language of the Bologna process, because everybody understands what a learning outcome is, but there are hundreds, literally hundreds of definitions of the word competences. For Bologna, in order to be compliant with the Bologna process, we must write learning outcomes for modules, short courses, and we must also write learning outcomes for programs. So the benefits and some potential problems need to be recognized. And in any training course that you organize for your professors, it's important that you lay these out. One of the foremost experts in the Bologna process in the world is Stephen Adams. And he talks about learning outcomes as representing the essential building blocks for transparent higher education. In other words, without learning outcomes, you cannot have the Bologna process. Judith Adams describes them as a celebration of student learning. We are putting down on paper what our students can do. So it's a celebration. So the benefits of learning outcomes are enormous. You can see there in the first bullet point that they help to explain more clearly to students what is expected of them and help to guide them in their studies. They help teachers to focus more clearly on what they want students to achieve in terms of knowledge and skills. They help teachers to clarify their thinking about what they want to achieve. In addition, they help us in the assessment to describe absolutely clearly to our students what we expect them to be able to do. And of course, they also help to provide guidance to employers about what graduates of a program will be able to do on graduating. And one of the things we discovered in University College Cork was that it helped us to start discussion on teaching and learning among colleagues that had never engaged in any educational training before. There are, of course, transnational implications of learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are used at local level within our third level institutions, but they're also used at national level for describing qualification frameworks and systems for quality assurance at our national level in each country. And they're also used at international level to ensure that we have clarity between our various universities in terms of how we describe our courses, and also to help us with mutual recognition. So really, as I said already, learning outcomes are the common language and the ECTS is the common currency. There are some problems. I've mentioned the word training over and over again. We need to train our professors to write learning outcomes so that we challenge our students. After all, we're teaching at university level, and therefore our students must be challenged in order to achieve the learning outcomes. We need to make sure that we always include the higher order thinking skills in our learning outcomes that we write. And of course, we mustn't confine them. They must be expansive. It could, of course, give great confusion among students and staff if learning outcomes are not properly written. And that was one of the first challenges that we had in University College Cork, to train our staff in the writing of learning outcomes and to make it clear to them why we were training them by putting it in the context of the Bologna process. The linking of the learning outcomes then to teaching and learning activities and to assessment is another key area. Now, there isn't a huge amount of training. You could train a member of staff in a university everything they need to know about the writing and using of learning outcomes, about the Bologna process, and about linking learning outcomes to teaching and learning, and also to assessment. One day's training is all that's needed. So the linking together of the teacher-centered approach, the student-centered approach, by using the information from the learning outcomes to make us better teachers. This dynamic equilibrium really summarizes what the whole situation is all about. We are here writing aims and objectives. As a result of the Bologna process, we have to write learning outcomes, and the equilibrium between these two helps us to become better teachers, help us to assess the students' achievement of the learning outcomes better, and help the students to be more focused on their work. What did we do in University College Cork to make this progress? Well, that's where we started. Back in 2005, we had all our courses written in terms of aims and objectives. We moved then and we asked all of our professors, please, as well as having the aims and objectives of the module, please write these in terms of learning outcomes. And we gave each professor a copy of the book. This was particularly useful that they had a hard copy so that in their own offices they could sit down and look at it. The next thing then we asked them to do was, could you look at how you're teaching and how the students are learning, and tell us what do you do to get the students to help the students to achieve the learning outcomes. That was stage number 3. And then we had to ask them, could you now check if the assessment that you have designed is in fact helping the students, helping you to see if the students have achieved the learning outcomes. And having done that, we checked for constructive alignment. Now, this is a bit of a mouthful, but essentially what it means is that the learning outcomes, the teaching and learning activities, and the assessment are all coordinated or lined up with each other. Very often, the professor said, well, I have been teaching this module for many years. I'm now going to make some changes. So the introduction of the learning outcomes at this stage brought about some changes. Learning outcomes is not something you do once and forget about it. Ideally, you revisit them. So don't expect your professors to get everything right after the first training session. They will go away, make changes, come back, and that is very good to make sure they bring about improvements. So if I were planning for the future, if I was there with you now, I would be looking at this wonderful 2020 document from the Bologna process. And it says, we reassert the importance of the teaching mission of higher education institutions and the necessity for ongoing curricular reform geared towards the development of learning outcomes. That's vitally important. So, the integration of learning outcomes into your teaching and learning is the key to success. Now, you will find some colleagues who are not happy with changing. The sort of things they might say, I don't like Bloom's taxonomy. They don't have to use Bloom's taxonomy to write learning outcomes, but it is the easiest. And if you read the book that I have produced there, you will see how easy it is to write learning outcomes. In some countries, this did not occur in Ireland because, as I say, we don't use competences. They're just too woolly and not very clear on the meaning of the term competences because, as I said, there are over 200 definitions of the word competence. If you have a course which is already written in competences, then the training that you give them must show the professors how to take a competence and write it in terms of learning outcomes. And if they understand what the competence is all about, they'll have no difficulty. Arising out of many of the lunchtime seminars, all our training courses were done during lunchtime. Our professors were invited in for lunch, and while they were drinking their coffee and eating their sandwich, we taught them about learning outcomes. And many of our professors said, I would like to get a qualification for teaching and learning in higher education. So we have now in this university postgraduate certificate, postgraduate diploma, masters in teaching and learning. And this of course has provided a great resource of qualified professors who can go back to their own department and train their colleagues. And for the first time ever, if any of you are interested, we now have an online postgraduate certificate in teaching and learning in higher education. And the course director of that is Dr. Marion McCarthy, and I'm sure my good friend Cleana will be able to fill you in on the details if you require any further information. So these are the sort of advertisements that we use. This is what we used in 2014-15 to encourage our staff to come to a briefing session given by the program director, my good colleague and friend, Dr. Marion McCarthy. So we set up in UCC initially in 2006 what was called the Teaching and Learning Centre. It's now called the Centre for the Integration of Research, Teaching and Learning. And so throughout the year, this provides a whole series of professional development courses for our professors. My time is coming up to 30 minutes, so I'll finish with the next slide. So in conclusion, therefore, the momentum was generated in University College Cork by being involved in international projects, by organising international conferences, bringing in speakers in the area of the Bologna process, in the area of learning outcomes and so on, the setting up of a teaching and learning centre, the setting up of qualifications, postgraduate certificate, diploma and masters in teaching and learning, and also by running various lunchtime seminars for staff. Without a doubt, the greatest challenge is staff training. If you train your staff and show, firstly, how easy it is to write learning outcomes, and secondly, how the writing of learning outcomes will make them better teachers and help them to achieve the learning outcomes in their students. It's important to keep the training simple, because the professors in your university may not have a great knowledge or background qualification in education. The Bologna process certainly is the driving force. It has been one of the most wonderful advances in the field of education ever undertaken. In some countries, like your own, there sometimes is a problem with the relationship between learning outcomes and competences, but that can easily be sorted out. The relationship between learning outcomes and ECTS credits, that's an important one. The idea of the learning outcomes being the common language and ECTS credits being the common currency. And by training your professors You will have expertise in various departments, and those professors can then train their own colleagues. The UCC Quality Promotion Unit was a great driving force. They did all the administration work. They booked the rooms, they organised the lunches, and all I had to do was turn up and deliver the training. So full marks to the Quality Promotion Unit, especially Dr. Norma Ryan in UCC. There has to be a great team effort between the people who are giving the courses, between the administrators, between the Quality Promotion Unit, and of course the help must come from the head of the university all the way down. The people who run the university must recognise the importance of the Bologna process. It has been wonderful talking to you. So, queridos amigos, gracias por su atención y espero que ahora podemos tener una pregunta y las respuestas a través de Skype. Muchísimas gracias.